Hi everyone. Today my guest is Connor Davidson. He's a Chief Technology Officer at Centrifuge. He's a truly fascinating guy with experience in building out tech and ITC solutions, leveraging his understanding of geopolitics in the African region. He has worked on both foreign African governments and other U.S. government projects. Connor has been working on technology solutions to address the what it's called a thermalization problem. We'll explore it on the pod that has plagued the artisanal small-scale mining and smallholder farmer sectors in Africa. That was a great episode. We focused on both geopolitics in the region and business opportunities. So hopefully you like. Don't forget to subscribe, comment down below, and hit the like button. Here we go.
For the folks that don't know me, I'm Connor, and I come from an audit and a tech background. I've been in the startup scene for a while, did some entrepreneurship both in Africa and in the US, setting up a tech traceability company. So we basically provided traceability services and tracking services for goods in the artisanal and small scale mine sector, as well as the smallholder farmer sector. So these were sectors that we identified where traceability offers a significant value proposition with a large enough potential user base to scale. So we sit across very early into the foundation of a small firm that we set up. My business partner Brian and I back in 2017 to solve a very specific problem. I had met Brian when I think I first given him a call. I met him through a mutual friend, Josh, over at HKS. And the way he was pitched to me was that Brian's doing this mining stuff in Congo. You should reach out to him. I was always fascinated with Congo. I was always fascinated with the heart of darkness. And it sort of it was very mystical and very difficult to understand. So I always wanted to go there to sort of break up the mystique. So when I was told that he has an American has an ongoing mining operation there, I was immediately gravitated towards Brian. I gave him a call. I introduced myself, some mutual friend of Josh. Wanted to know what you're up to in the Congo and see, is there anything that I can do to sort of get in on that. At the time, I was auditing in Boston, so I was commuting in and commuting out and working 90-hour work weeks, doing IT audits for banks, financial institutions, cloud service providers, and anything that needs to be audited from a regulatory or a legal requirement. And so I was just doing this I guess factory audit and consulting gig, where we were just ground to our bare teeth. We were working so many hours, it's ridiculous. So we were mostly doing SOX 404s. Pen tests, vulnerability scanning. We're doing application testing, IT general controls assessments, SOC 2s, SOC 1s, Type 1s, and Type 2s, this A18 reporting, FIDISHA audits. Those are the worst. But everything was really boring and very stressful at the same time. So it was something that I was kind of losing my interest in, but it gave me such a massive understanding of how enterprises in the US, at least, how they function and they manage risk, how they operate within a relatively risk mitigated environment, and they're able to handle any sort of risks that would affect their or would have a material impact on their financial statements. And so, I got really good at understanding how banks work, how financial institutions work, throughout the organization, right? Because you're really auditing every IT system that it touches within the bank. So you kind of get an understanding of how these things function, especially over the last 10 or so years. These financial institutions have largely become more and more reliant on IT. And any sort of a digitized system, right? So they now more than ever it's central to their business model. So if you're auditing an IT system within that institution, you're largely going to be understanding that system from the inside out. And so I got a really good understanding of how these things function, along with cloud service providers. But I hated it, right? It was terrible. I mean, anybody that works at the Big Four, or it does auditing full time, like, they can tell you it's soul crushing. It's not the best. But it's so crazy how amazing your understanding of companies becomes when you're auditing those systems. And you have a whole new perspective on risk management, but more importantly, how the businesses function or how they don't. And so I took that knowledge, and on this phone call, I was explaining to Brian and kind of pitching myself as like a person who understands risk management. We were doing risk assessments all the time. So I can take the skills that I've acquired doing that for financial institutions, which are some of the most secure in the world, and apply that to a place that has almost no inherent security and risk management, which is conflict affected and high risk areas, which DRC is one of, if not the most conflict affected country. So he immediately was like, yeah, that sounds great. So we set forth a few weeks to work on a risk management and financial risk management plan, so that he could raise some money he wanted to do a tantalum trading operation. And tantalum's useful in this semiconductor that is manufactured, the tantalum transistors. And 90% of the actual reserves are held within one area in the Congo. And so because of its heavy concentration in the DRC, and because it's the criticality of its role and its use, and the illegal taxation of the mining activities that go into that, to the mining of coltan is the name of the ore. The result of that has been that it has been listed as what's called a Dodd-Frank Section 1502 3 TGs conflict mineral. So within 3 TGs, there's tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold, and the ores of which that are possibly dug from DRC, publicly traded companies in the United States that are listed and sort of overseen by the SEC. Those publicly traded companies have to have if they're manufacturing anything with tin, tantalum, tungsten, or gold in their supply chains, they have to have this very rigorous, thorough due diligence system that it really acts more like a checkbox than anything. But it does force a company to have this huge conflict minerals team that has to go through and audit their entire supply chain. So before any of the semiconductor disruptions were happening, before any of the cobalt stuff was happening, I was watching it happen in real time. The deal actually that Hunter Biden was associated with the Chinese company, his firm was associated with sort of the aggressive and hostile takeovers of the DRC. I don't know if he knew, but I was watching it happen. I didn't even know until recently that he was part of that. But the DRC is a very unforgiving place. The surrounding countries are fairly safe, but DRC is not. It's fairly difficult to operate in those places, but it is incredibly resource rich. And so from my perspective, it seemed to be an awesome opportunity to pursue. I think towards the end of 2017, I quit doing auditing, and I went full time. Pulled the trigger on the centrifuge thing with Brian, and we set up a company to do this tantalum trading traceability system. The reason why we chose traceability is because the tracing system was one of the biggest cost and risk areas that could have a material impact on the financial statements of the trading company. So instead of outsourcing it, we decided to vertically integrate that within our company. And that's where Centrifuge was really born, was out of that. Understanding that in order to understand the entire supply chains, your supply chain, and manage your risk, you need to understand throughout all levels, and throughout the entire chain of custody and the value chain, who is doing what and where. And that knowledge is power. So that's kind of my background and my story, how it got started.
I have a lot of questions. First
Proceed.
of all, like 90 hours a week, is it even legal to work so much?
Well, you're salaried, so they don't care. They work you like a dog. Um, and if you don't get your work on time, done on time, because you're overworked, they don't. I mean, my boss would brag about sleeping at her desk when she was at PwC, and I was like, oh God, this is psychotic.
Oh my.
Then I was commuting too, which was crazy. I was like working these obscene hours, and having to commute. So I was like, this is terrible. I don't want to do this. Um, but while I was there, I was still trying to pitch to them because I wanted to get involved in the Congo, and I saw a huge, massive audit opportunity and advisory service opportunity for the firm that I was working for at the time, to get involved in these Dodd-Frank Section 1502 audits. And I saw this way before really anyone was watching this in the audit world. They were like, Congo, like who cares about the Congo? Like nobody cares. This is before the whole the cobalt prices exploded. Actually, right before. And I was like, I don't know. There's something about this that seems to be very, huge, and that this could be a problem. And I didn't really get anywhere with these guys, so I instead applied that to starting up my own company. Um,
But
that
you
was Brian.
did you start a company or did you collaborate
Yeah,
with
yeah.
Brian?
We set up a company called Centrifuge, to
Mm.
do the traceability and tech solutions. Now we're more of a consulting service provider. Um, we're not so much doing sort of a centrally located hub where it's just we're providing cloud hosted tracking and tracing services. More so, we're helping companies implement their own tracing services, and sort of guiding, holding their hands through the process of complying with other different regulatory requirements that chain of custody and all these other things are a strict requirement to comply with. So that's, that provides some, keeps the lights on. So, but that's something that is very tricky for companies to be able to, even if they have this really amazing tracing system, mobile app, and all these little expensive gadgetry. If they don't implement the system correctly, and then if they don't monitor it and manage it correctly, and set it up, then it's not going to work, and they're not going to comply with the requirements, and so they're going to lose out money. So that's where we found significant value proposition, was helping out.
Yeah.
So like
Yeah.
anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist finance, stuff like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, is it right that the company that Brian was working on, the mining thing, and your guys' company, is it completely privately owned, or does it have to do with the government? What's the relationship between you and the U.S. government or the local governments? Just to get more context.
Yeah. So I mean, typically when you're operating in places like the Congo, a lot of these countries are former Marxist countries, and having risen out of socialism once they were declared independent from their colonial powers. And so there was this large surge of towards socialist policies, and the remnants of which you can still see to this day, even if they've all liberalized. And one of those sort of tendencies that you see is that a lot of these governments will require you to have a joint venture. So they require you to have like local ownership is like more than 50%. So 51% joint venture with government partners. And I can see why they do that. I wouldn't trust a huge multinational either. Having worked for them, I understand. And but I think that it's an interesting thing is who is what and who controls what, and what is the agency behind that. It's usually difficult to tell in these places. Case in point, there's a few companies that were basically shell companies for Wagner, that were in the DRC, and it wasn't clear that they were Wagner at all. There's also like Primera, for example. Primera has a really good deal with the government, but they had to lobby hard for that to get a tax waiver, and a tax discount to only 0.3%. But it wasn't clear that it was necessarily Primera from the get-go until the Emiratis stepped in and they sent official delegations, right? And so the nature of getting involved in places like the Congo usually mean that you have to have the backing of your government. You have to have the blessings of them. Up until just recently, the DRC did not even have really a strong State Department staff or set of resources they can draw from. So there wasn't a lot of like support for U.S. public-private partnerships in those areas, and so it was really difficult to get anything done. But now that we have a new ambassador who's great, this problem has largely been reconciled. That and there's more trade that's coming in thanks to the Lobito Corridor. So Brian has set up a new company that he's also trying to get financing and funding through, USTDA, U.S. Trade and Development Agency. And he actually has a 51% spread as well. So they have a joint venture with his Kasenge manganese mine. And then he's been eyeing this thing for close to 15 years now. He's partnered with the DRC government on that, but he still retains a sizable portion of the material funds that are given to him from the sale of manganese. So it depends. Does that answer your question a little bit on how this dynamic plays out?
Yeah, that makes sense. What about the Lobito Corridor, just for people who don't even understand where it is, what it is, why it is there, what benefits it brings to the economies, just a high-level overview.
Yeah, I mean, well, you could go into the weeds on this one. The Lobito Corridor is a trade corridor that was originally was called the Bengala Rail Line, and it was rebuilt and upgraded by the Chinese. And then just recently, the U.S. Tasked its folks, National Security Council, State Department, and Commerce, and other folks in the U.S. government with sort of securing this new trade corridor as a means of accessing electric vehicle battery metals. So the big, huge thing here was that you have Zambia was the big star child of that was selected during the African Leader Summit to be the recipient of a lot of this development funding, but they're landlocked. So it became very clear very rapidly that even though it has a substantial amount of copper, cobalt, and some nickel reserves as well, that getting that copper, cobalt out meant it would have to go through the DRC, which is fine. There is rail, but it needed to be upgraded significantly. And that rail line leads to the parts that are finished. They lead to ultimately Lobito Corridor, so they go westbound into the Port Lobito in Angola, which then you can get on a ocean cargo ship and ship the minerals out to Texas or any of the ports there that do the off-taking. So that's strategic in nature because you need, I think it's like 80% of the world's copper cobalt supply between the DRC and Zambia. They control 80% of the world's copper cobalt, right? And that's massive, right? You even had the CEO of Ivanhoe Mines recently talking about the copper prices are going to surge with the Fed getting rid of interest rates or reducing them. And that's going to cause a significant uptick in sort of the price of copper and investments into sort of manufacturing is largely the driver of this, right? There's a lot of electric vehicles and battery technology and more specifically, what he also brought up was the fact that it's the 155 millimeter round shells, the howitzers that are used in Ukraine. People often forget that these bullets, these shells, this ammunition, all that has to be mined from somewhere, right? They don't recycle a lot of this, and so you typically have to get it from very cheap places. that are hard to access. Otherwise, it would have been mined by now. And so what you find is that these mines that have been struggling to survive over the past 10, 15 years in DRC are now becoming the star childs, right? And this is a huge critical success factor for either China or the United States in their sort of their struggle on I guess, the East versus West type civilization, new Cold War, to secure those strategic supplies. So a lot of that is like, how do you build in the necessary infrastructure and support the necessary folks that need to facilitate the construction in the private sector, the critical infrastructure that is going into supporting the Lobito Corridor. And what is that going to look like? How are people staying on top of things? Is the interest verifiably legitimate and significant? Are the U.S. government-backed financial institutions providing the necessary capital and financing for supporting these types of activities? These are all things that, it takes a whole team of folks to really get a good grasp of. But the strategic objectives are there, for sure.
Yeah, makes sense. I know that this might be a simplification, and correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I understand, like this whole investment from like the American government, from the EU to the Lobito corridor is like a response to what China is doing in Africa. So this is basically like a geopolitical Cold War of trying to get the hands to the minerals, to the resources, and to try to not let China have everything there.
Yeah, and there's two fronts to that too. What China uses, one front is very offensive and covert, right? In that the actual efforts of that are targeting these areas and targeting these projects are deniable as far as the Chinese government goes. Like, they won't want to have any attachment. You can plausibly deny it, at least. And then there's the trade-based mechanisms that China is trying to build into the other segment of the Lobito Corridor, called the Tazara Rail Line. Tanzania had really great relations up until recently with the U.S. It seems that China now is sort of resurging back into Africa through Tanzania. Whereas when President Magufuli died, the relations between the United States and Tanzania flourished for a temporary period. Up until the results that followed the African Leader Summit. It seems now more the case that there's an uptick in Chinese investments through Tanzania, which has historically hosted a lot of the sort of the large empires that span from the east of Africa to all the way to the west. So like hundreds of years ago, all the way up to like the late 1800s, early 1900s. With the Belgians in the Congo, right? The Belgians came across the Sultanate of Zanzibar, and that was a huge problem because they were trying to, from their perspective, milk the Congo and expand and control the eastern corridor, right? Where all those minerals are, where all the rubber is, where all the cobalt is, all the gold. That was what they were after. Unfortunately, that's also the place where it's most insecure and farthest away from the capital, Kinshasa. And so you had the Sultanate on one hand, who was Omani, which is very strange. Why would Oman? It's because of the way that Oman is more proximal to Zanzibar and the role that it played in proliferating the sort of the British East India Trading Company. But because of that, that's where the Sultanate was based out of Zanzibar. It's an island off the coast of Tanzania. And then all of the trade that would go all the way through Tanzania and out into the Congo would be through this Sultanate. And so he controlled these trading networks all the way out to even the farthest reaches of the DRC at the time. And this was for, a long time. This was how Congo's resources were being milked. But it's unfortunately, largely it was slave labor and slaves that were being sold in markets in Zanzibar that were the reason why that was such a key critical success sort of controlling factor during that era, right? And so then when the Belgians took it over, they kind of just set up the border and didn't really expand beyond that, and didn't really sort of effectively secure or stabilize the entire region. It was just kind of like, okay, we're going to have this entire country as a colony, but they didn't really have a considerable sort of effort that was put into long-term stability. So when the Belgians left in the 1960s, they left behind a massive set of infrastructure projects that were either in development or about to be finished. Kasenge Manganese is one such project where they just left entire projects, entire rail lines, entire systems that were almost like artifacts of a bygone era. And so over the 40 years that 50, 60 years since then, you can still see some of that infrastructure show up. So the Wangala rail line was an example of that. It's key to understanding how that all plays out, and how the infrastructure right now is sort of the key battlegrounds. China's strategy is to go back into Tanzania after having lost its position in Africa. And so now they've come back and they're really pushing for projects, the SGR railway, standard gauge railway. And so all of they're pushing back into Zambia. I don't know the status of how well they're pushing into DRC. I think the U.S. has kind of kept them at bay. But certainly Zambia and Tanzania are places where, if you want to access the critical minerals that you need to wage war, those are the two countries that, are certainly the most important to secure agreements with long-term infrastructure projects.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you mentioned conflict potential, and Africa has always been the place in 20th century, 21st century of military conflicts, different groups, different influences. What's the situation there, maybe around DRC, in terms of any military groups or anything? I've read about M23. Maybe you can tell a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, this is M23 is a bit of an interesting subject. How do I put this? So, yeah, for the past, oh wow, this is going to be we're going to have to dive deep in this. Okay, so in 1993, up until that point, basically all of these countries, Rwanda, Burundi, DRC, had been run by Hutu majority ethnic group folks like Mobutu Sese Seko, right? And so these countries had there was calls for there was clear tension between the Tutsis and the Hutus all the way dating back since the colonial governments had come to power. But particularly in the last set of years from the 60s all the way up to the 90s, Paul Kagame and Museveni had sort of won their positions in the 80s within Uganda, and were now training to go take back Rwanda, because they were the Tutsi led force that was there to remove the Hutus and restore power to the Tutsis. And so there was calls for genocide, and there was calls for this and that, and attacks on populations, but it was being diffused. It was the problems were kept at bay, and even the Hutu president himself was trying in Rwanda was trying to push back on them, and he even drew concerns about sort of his own sort of the calls for arms. It was very unfortunate that he, I think it was in '93, was carrying most of his cabinet, his ministers, and the Burundi president, who was also Hutu, went in. I think he was trying to land the presidential jets near in Kigali, and it was shot down by a surface-to-air missile, a man-pad system, that had been essentially stolen from a Ugandan military depot. And so this was, yeah, it was, so that set off a chain of events that we still have not recovered from to this day. And the results of that have left this giant gaping scar in Africa, along the Eastern Corridor. And so when that happened, there was the Rwandan genocide, but there was also the first and second Great African Wars that lasted from 97 all the way up to I believe 2007-ish. That costs. I mean, I don't know. The estimates vary, but 5 to 10 million is a reasonable assumption. And so the even though the Rwandan genocide was less than that, the death toll that has resulted over that huge period in the Great Africa, in the two African wars. I mean, that was the devastation that is unleashed, and the mines, the unexploded munitions that have been left from those wars is just incredible. And it also led to the installation of basically a kleptocrat, Joseph Kabila, who murdered. Well, some people say he had his father assassinated. I don't know the rumors, but Laurent Kabila, when he seized power in 2001, he was assassinated by his supposedly a bodyguard. And then Joseph Kabila, his son, took power and ran it up until 2018. And then you had the President Tshisekedi just recently took over in 2019. But up until that point, Joseph Kabila had basically sold all of the mining rights, all of the rights to this, to that, to this mine, to that mine, to either Dan Gertler or to the Chinese, right? Which was very dangerous because the Chinese over the last, I want to say, since they've been in the Congo since the 70s, as have the United States and Canada. But they, over the last, since like 2015, 2014, they set forth a specific campaign to dominate the copper cobalt mining activities in those areas. And that is critically strategic. And it also has allowed them to levy trade like a weapon to destroy private enterprise in the United States to favor their own companies, or to use as a geopolitical tool, as a mechanism for getting other countries to fall in line with Chinese policy. So this is, I mean, there's a giant history here that this one event led to all of that. Just this ricocheting out of different permutations of cause and effect. And again, we haven't stabilized the Eastern Corridor. So what you're seeing now with M23 is that when the first and second Great African Wars entered in as part of an intervention force, they left behind sort of this vacuum of FDLR rebels, Mai militias that grew in response, the ADF, the M23, or what later became M23. These rebel factions all sort of arose out of that period, right? Because they noticed that there was these massive deposits of gold and other minerals that they could tap into. Diamonds, gems, other natural resources that could fund them. In fact, actually, that was really the heart of the argument and the disagreements between Rwanda and Uganda's president as well. And so when you had all these resources coming together, even the intervention force that was supposedly unified were starting to fight amongst one another about who gets what mine and which diamonds get which, who gets what diamonds and timber rights. And so what you have is this sort of balkanization of the Eastern Corridor that has led to, tragically, many, many, many more people just dying in horrific circumstances because they couldn't get access to capital. They couldn't, they couldn't get the necessary, jobs that were critical to having a stable home life. Right, people who have become alcoholics and the people who have become gambling addicts, like the poachers, the tragedies of this are all stemming from that one event, and it still hasn't been reconciled to this day. M23 is right now is the pariah of the international community, because they essentially have taken over these gold mines in the eastern Congo in North Kivu, and they were essentially restricting access to these mines and the transit corridors that lead away from those mines. So they would tax and also just reappropriate mines directly within the DRC. There is no gold mines in Rwanda. There is no tantalum mines in Rwanda. It's even if the Rwandans claim there is. So all of these gold and tantalum exports go to Rwanda, as well as tin for milk cans and for other things. And so you had essentially a massive theft of DRC's territorial integrity that was protected by the M23 rebel group, and those folks went into sort of protecting those interests. They would, regularly shoot people that would try to sort of threaten their illegal activities. They would, the Rwandan intelligence officers would penetrate into, the networks of the customs authorities, and would either blackmail or bribe people, or have them killed if they didn't play nice. So you can see how this is a significant problem. I think they've moved. The latest on that is that they're supposed to be retreating this month and next month, per an agreement that they arrived at. But I'm skeptical. I also see greater emphasis being placed on what happened in the Congo is now happening in Central African Republic. So I think that's the next conflict to watch out for.
Yeah, yeah, those stories are crazy, and many people in the West don't really understand them. They are not aware, even about uh, the major wars, even the genocide. Like this has to be talked about because it's just something that people are not really aware of, as long as far as I understand. But I still want to take a step back. You obviously have a deep insight into a lot of those events in the region. Do you see any patterns of um, how should we deal with that? How would we minimize human suffering, deaths, stuff like that? Because it seems like, from outside, that we have those major powers, China, the U.S., who are uh, trying to compete in the region, which does not necessarily mean that there will be less conflict moving forward. So, what do you think government should do to deal with the situation as a whole?
Yeah. So this is going to be another complicated answer, but it's very the root cause of the problem is very deep, deeply rooted into that dynamic. But luckily, I've established the historical context here, so I can kind of dive into these sort of the contemporary dynamics of how this plays out. But the reason why M23 is in where it is, and why Paul Kagame, who used to be the star child of the favored member of the international community, who's now a pariah, the reason why he is in and supporting M23, despite the overwhelming backlash that has caused, is because he can get away with it, first of all, and second of all, he relies on the revenue up until recently, until he got more involved in the Central African Republic's gold sector. So the problem with that is that because he has a total unilateral control over his party, which is the only party really, and he is. I mean, if you look at dictatorships, he has more control over Rwanda than Xi Jinping has control over China by by incredible margins. I mean, this guy has total control over his country, and so in order to have that, you need to have a bunch of key supporters that are all providing you the necessary political, military, intelligence traits, commercial support, these types of things in the private and public sectors, in the NGO groups. So if you're controlling the way that the money is flowing, the resources are flowing to those folks, then you're controlling the keys to power. right? And the only way you can do that is if you do it far outside of the standard reporting lines in which money is typically recorded as being official records. So you need to have black budget funds, right? And that allows you to pay for these really dirty intelligence operations and paramilitary groups within the Eastern DRC that further advance your control, which then further advance your how much money you can get in and how much money you can expand outwards, right? So it's a positive feedback loop. But that's critical to understanding it because the dark money thing is really a big problem because if he loses access to that dark money channel, right, then he loses access to his key supporter to keep his key supporters in line, to keep them funded, and to keep their key supporters in line. And so he'll basically be replaced, and he knows this, right? So and the U.S. has been very hesitant to sort of intervene in this issue because the U.K. has a very strong favorable relationship with Paul Kagame. That has really kind of made it very awkward for the United States to call Paul Kagame out on some of the things that we've very easily called other world leaders out for much, much less. And so Kagame needs to ensure that one thing happens, that as far as accessing that dark money, he needs to ensure that the money consistently flows and that the small scale mining and the smallholder farmers stay small scale, because if they don't, what ends up happening is they formalize and they don't need him as an intermediary midstream choke point, right? And if that happens, then he can just go straight to the end market and the buyers. And so Paul Kagame has spent a considerable amount of time and effort over the past, I don't know how many years, 30 years, basically ensuring that this problem never gets solved. Because if it does, then he won't have the ability to largely operate as a landlocked country with no real natural resources to speak of. And so this is the difference between being incredibly powerful as a member of the Commonwealth of Nations and being an incredibly strong political and geopolitical player, and being largely subject to the whims of its surrounding powers that surround Rwanda. And so, he recognizes this, and I sort of recognize his constraints that are imposed onto him. But I also think that we can't just sit by and let DRC be destabilized over the past, I mean, we can't simply go, oh, it's really difficult. We can't, so one of the things that I did while I was doing that auditing, I happened to meet through a rare circumstance, Claire Akamanzi, who is she was the director of the Rwanda Development Board. She's largely seen as the replacement to Kagame when he leaves office. She's been sort of groomed throughout the years to be the replacement to him, and she's been controlling trade and the mechanisms that keep Rwanda's sort of machinations flowing. And one of the things that I did talk to her at the time, because I was researching the conflict minerals stuff, is how does Rwanda contend with that? How do they reconcile with that? And then how do we move from here? At the time, she didn't really have an answer, and I was surprised that I was stupid enough to ask that question. But now, having sort of 3 + 4, 5 years onwards in 2022, I asked. There was a Zoom call through I think it was the Business International Council set this up, where Claire Akamanzi was scheduled to speak, and her deputy ended up being there instead because she was on some other matters. But the deputy confirmed exactly what I suspected was the way forward, and they were already working on a solution, which is to say that you need to incorporate some kind of carbon credits and agroforestry component into your solution, both on a trade and security level. Right, the only way that you can actually get the DRC and Rwanda to start to begin the process of reconciliation, either Rwanda starts doing the DRC stuff, but in a different country, and we kind of just go, okay, well, whatever, screw that other country, or there has to be positive bilateral trade between DRC and Rwanda that otherwise wouldn't be feasible without Rwanda as a sort of intermediary. And that is an incredible opportunity, I think, for for peace and reconciliation between those two countries. Because if you can set up a model where the tax code variances between the DRC side and the Rwandan side are offset by some sort of advantage within, agriculture or animal industry or of some sort, you can get into a position where your the revenue that you're losing out on from the smuggling is by all accounts made up for by considerable orders of magnitude, with a new industry that replaces the gold sector, that replaces those other ones, and helps clean up that sector. Though it's not clear that the although the Rwanda Development Board has this in the works, it's not clear that the president of Rwanda would approve of this as being a sort of bilateral trade agreement. And it's very important that this problem be solved as well. A lot of what Paul Kagame does is generally try to get DRC its image sort of destroyed in order to prevent foreign direct investment into the Congo. He wants to be the focal point through which all trade, all sort of security operations are sort of focused. That will allow him to control essentially the entirety of those informal sectors. And I think that when you look at it through that lens, you go, well, how can you even negotiate with that position, right? If you're President Tshisekedi and you're coming in and you're going like, okay, well, if I'm going to be operating in good faith and trying to negotiate a retreat plan, you can't trust that Paul Kagame is going to act in good faith because he has no intent on doing so. That's not necessarily the case with his deputy and with his soon-to-be president. So, this is something that I think takes a greater, there needs to be a greater examination of the role that Rwanda plays right now, and the leadership of Rwanda and its role in the geopolitical security situation. Because that right there, as long as that is left as an open question, the Lobito Corridor, specifically the DRC component, will not be funded. As long as there is a prevailing threat that is imposed onto any sort of foreign direct investments. So even if the country is insecure insofar as having rebel groups and terrorists, that's even though that's far north, the country as a whole is considered, by large, the private investor community doesn't want to put money into a country that has an ongoing insurgency. So you can see how this is a problem and why this has been pervasive to this day. I apologize for the long-winded explanation, but I hope that kind of elucidates.
Yeah. No, that makes sense, and that's a lot of insight, and I'm really glad that you shared it. We have about 3, maybe 5 minutes left. Is there anything else you want to share, like any insight or any things that you want to tell people related to the DRC, to the Lobito Corridor, or to anything else that you think is going to be valuable to share?
Yeah. So, I mean, thank you for offering that too. So, when it comes down to business and entrepreneurship, with SoftBank not SoftBank, the Silicon Valley banks that recently went bust last year, the sort of the standard model of going through a startup is starting to wane. It's the ability to do that anymore is very difficult to get capital for startups, right? And you have to get clever now to do a sort of entrepreneurship, and look at some of the places where there is massive growth. So my advice to young entrepreneurs out there who are trying to find areas to get involved in and add significant value proposition. I think one of those markets that I think is one of the fastest growing would be the Congo, would be Zambia, Angola, Tanzania, DRC, Uganda, and these places, because they're so rapidly developing, and it's really about how do you manage your risk when you're operating in those places, and what kind of value proposition can you offer such that you are invaluable to the point where nobody can just kind of kick you out, or it'd be very difficult to do that. And I think one of the other challenges that you're going to come across if you do operate in these places, whether it's in the Congo or whether it's in the forests in Brazil, you have to solve the formalization challenge. That is to say that most of the trade in these developing countries is largely informal, and to what extent your value proposition can resolve, either minimize or mitigate that formalization symptoms of that. I think would go a long way as far as like the ability to offer a substantial enough value proposition such that you can charge money for it. So that's my sort of guidance and advice for young entrepreneurs that are trying to get involved in things. But yeah, the Congo is pretty rough. I wouldn't start out in the Congo.
Yeah, but that's a great insight generally about Africa, because like people in the West, they kind of don't really consider outside markets, especially the ones that they don't really understand. But as you're saying, there is an opportunity there, and maybe there is a reason to start looking into that, and maybe to capitalize on the problems that there exist and the ones that you can solve with your service or product.
Yeah, I mean, Zihan also talks about population demographics, right? Peter Zihan, former Strat 4 guy, right? And he was keen to point this out, that this is a problem that no one was looking at. And one of the biggest problems is, even Egypt, that has a population of 100 and something plus million, right? They're over the next 20, 25 years are going to face significant problems, right? Because of the deprivation of silt that is usually deposited on the Nile River, which is being dammed by Ethiopia. I mean, that alone could start a war over there. But then you just have across the board, all over the world, there's aging populations that are just teetering on collapse. China being one of them. And one of the populations of people that are not decreasing and collapsing, and in fact actually are thriving, are the East African populations of those countries. But more specifically the Congo. I mean, they have more than 100 million people, which is insane. Like, this is a massive market that people don't think about because they don't hear about anything in the Congo. But if the DRC and the East African community as a whole can get its stuff together, I mean, this would be the power of that. What that would represent would be unprecedented in terms of its wealth transfer and its ability to build wealth.
Yeah, I think it's a great time to conclude this conversation. But I think that's a great insight. It's a very interesting stories about what's happening in the region. Just to get more context, get more real understanding from the person who can get into the weeds, into the situation. But yeah, I'm really grateful to have you on today, and thanks, Connor, for coming.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you having me here.